Hi everyone, it's Alan Schimmel, DevOps.com, and we're here at the DevOps Enterprise Summit UK 2018. And we have three speakers, each of which probably needs no introduction to our audience at DevOps TV, but let me do it anyway. To my far right, none other than John Willis, the one and only. John, welcome.
Thank you. Hey, good to be here.
Sitting next to John, Cornelia Davis. Cornelia, welcome to DevOps TV here. And to my immediate right, my friend Damon Edwards of Rundeck.
Hey, Alan, how you doing?
Good, Damon. Nice to have you here. So, guys, a little different than maybe some of the interviews we've done in the past. We'd like to do a deeper dive today, and we're going to explore a topic. Our topic for today is NextGen Ops. Some are calling it new ops. Some are calling, well, no ops, thank God. I haven't heard the term no ops recently. But,
at least the last year or so.
Well, that's forever in my world, John. But anyway, Damon, I've seen you champion this, so I'm going to give you the chance to kind of define it. What do we mean by NextGen Ops?
Well, I don't think it's like a thing. I think it's just saying that how do we, in this modern world, right, the go fast and the lock it down, we got that, and we have all this next generation sort of infrastructure platform technologies. So how do we operate this new stuff so we can do the new business, meet the new business demands? And I think the sort of the problem we're solving is, the development side of the house has had almost 20 years of agile sort of seeping into their brains. On the ops hasn't had that. Like ops has had since 1990 ITIL seeping into their brains, which is a different, kind of a different way of viewing the world. So kind of this modern operations ideas about how do we take these DevOps and agile ideas and break them down to the kind of first principles and apply them to all of this new technology, these new business demands, so we can transform operations the way that we've done a good job of transforming dev in the DevOps kind of world.
Cornelia, your world is more in the developer side of things. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so it's interesting because, as you know, I work for Pivotal. And when I started my work at Pivotal, I very much self-identified as a developer. And because that's what I'd been my entire career, 30 years or something like that. And then I got there and was working on platform as a service and realized that it was just as much of an ops story as it was a developer story. So I've had that benefit of having come from the development side and then seen some of the challenges that we have in the ops side. And so what's super interesting is to take this idea, the idea that Damon just described, but apply that to slightly different, very much related, but slightly different themes, because there are different jobs to be done by the ops people than there are the developers, and a new set of primitives, and to bring those two things together. So it's kind of from the above and coming up from the below being all the primitives that you have, the platforms that Damon mentioned, and from above being the requirements. And so it's the requirements that are changing. We're moving a lot faster, and the developers are actually bringing things to us more quickly, us being operations folks, and I have new platforms, and that's very intriguing.
It's challenging as well. John, but let me pose a...
Can I chime in?
Of course you can.
Thank you. Now, one of the things I look for, like these signposts, right? And I think being part of IT Revolution and it's created an incredible network for all of us. Being part of DevOps Days has created a network. Being at Docker, so I've gotten a lot of people. Like all my best friends are all taking jobs as VP of Next Generation Platform Development in large corporations. So I see this macro trend within the last 2 years. And we've had like the past, and some of that is still in play, but like large corporations are starting to like ask this question about, okay, in 2018, what do we need to look like in the next 3 years? And this is more of a technology. I totally agree with you, both of you on the meta side, but I see, like a Nick Weaver going over to Nike, and he's a platform genius, right? And different people like that are taking these new kind of roles back in large corporations. So that tells me there's this yearning in the enterprise to whatever past is prologue. And so then, like, now I'm interested in what does that look like. I have my opinions, of course, but I think that's, to me, that the fabric of the future and how are they going to evolve.
You know what I think is so interesting about that is that in the past, and still existing in enterprises today, is a lot of the plan, build, run. And you're pointing out that what we're seeing now is we're seeing a shift from plan, build, run to platform teams, platform engineering teams. And I was noticing, like, Jason Cox has the title of systems engineer. And so we're starting to see titles like VP of platform, VP of systems engineering, and that's something that didn't exist in IT before.
Yeah. So let me play devil's advocate if I can. Mm-hmm. You know, for too long I heard from friends of mine in the IT space in general, security specifically, DevOps is just some evil scheme to let devs take control of ops, and it's a dev-centric world. But yet I've heard from devs, is DevOps, it's given all the power to ops. The ops control everything. No, you know, and maybe that's always the sign of a real compromise when both sides are a little unhappy. But did we fall out of equilibrium here where we need to have a
I'm going to talk about this in my presentation a little bit today, right? 3 years, so there was this phenomenon that happened, 4 years ago? It was called Docker, right? And it changed, and it actually gave, for the first time, developers this ability to go so far into the stack without any operation or minimal operational help, right? At least that was the promise, and it was happening. And it's why Docker went incredibly viral the first 2 years, right? Because developers, I believe, had the first time in their life felt like they had more control in the delivery of what they were doing. Life goes on, and the interesting question about, how do you manage that at scale comes along. Then a technology called Kubernetes comes in, and now basically it's a mess because nobody knows who owns that. So like with Docker, there was, or let's say containers, but mostly Docker, was this whole, the developers now have this freedom to drive infrastructure pretty deep into it, in some place have a lot of control of the delivery from an infrastructure standpoint. Then you get into how do you scale the architecture. Kubernetes starts getting incredibly popular. And now, really from what I see, most of the case, the developers are responsible for maintaining Kubernetes, and now they're kind of worse off than they were. And I'm pro Kubernetes all the way. I mean, I think that is the future. I'll say that right now. But it is kind of messy right now because what looked like a clean path just got awfully ugly all over again. And developers are like, well, this is a lot harder than the Docker stuff. Yeah. You know, it's just when you get into stateful stuff, right? And anyway, so, I mean, there's this weird, developers look like they had this clearer path. Yeah. And now we're back kind of being messy all over again. I mean,
that battle's always been fought, which is what's application, what's the platform, what's the infrastructure. So it's like I think what we're seeing is it's because the same operating model is still baked in everyone's heads. So now we have this new technology. We're still suffering from the old operating model, right? And I think that now what we're seeing with the platform, kind of the smarter companies going sort of the platform organization, right? It's no longer about operations. It's about how do you bake the kind of best practices of operations into as much of that platform as possible. So then give control to the rest of the organization through kind of pull-based self-service. But it's that ability to build, just the right amount of platform, but they have to rethink it instead of being, hey, because on operations, they've got all these different silos. We have ticket queues, and that's how the operations still, in a lot of organizations, still works. So now on the challenge of the platform organization, why it's so important, is to try to bake all of that, instead of the ticket queues, into a self-service platform, and really that operations as a service term we use a lot, but for the rest of the organization. And that's a new operating model. It totally fundamentally breaks how people in operations think about their job and their specialties and their silos. So I just think that it's just that has to come along. That hasn't caught up yet. That's kind of my point about, the agile side's been seeping in for a long time, and ops, it's still the ITIL, mindset that's been baked in for the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is the contracts. So what are the contracts that the platform is going to project up that the developers and the application teams are going to consume. And getting that contract right is really, really important. And when we did it in a smaller setting, when we were just doing application dial tone, platform as a service, we came up with some good contracts that worked well. Back to your point of Kubernetes, that has completely made fuzzy what that contract is. And so I actually think of it not so much as a flattening, but what we've done is we've added an extra layer in there, and we haven't figured out what the right contract is for the application teams and for the developers.
Could be. I mean, certainly I think we're in a state of flux, and there is that push-pull, right, between these different constituencies, if you will.
Well, I'm just wondering about that. I think the problem is because like the DevOps idea was great around the edges, and it was really fine until suddenly you actually have to change. Then the pushback comes, right? Like it sounds so awesome. Yeah, we're going to actually we're going to take over. We're going to run our own things, and then they actually have to do it. It's like I didn't really want to do this. Can I give this back, right? And then operations side, it's like, oh, that's great. Like we're going to do those things, and then you actually have to change how you actually work. And it's like, oh man. So I think a lot of the sort of counter reformation or kind of pushback you're getting from these different sides, because it doesn't make sense that they're each saying different things. It's just a reaction to that. It's actually cutting deep. We're actually getting deeper into these organizations and affecting broader change, and that's just hard.
And I want to ask Cornelia something. So I'm going to play I actually know this, but it's for our listeners. Wink, wink. Can you go a little deep into the contracts? Because I think that's incredibly interesting. Like the transition of like where we kind of felt safe and now we're kind of unsafe.
Yeah. And so, for example, the thing that I know best is Cloud Foundry, which is the product that I've been working on. And the fundamental contract between the app team and the platform team provided a contract that said, we're going to give you application dial tone. What you as the developer do, or as the DevOps, the app team.
Kind of like the Heroku, like you put
exactly.
your code
you
here.
say, here's my code.
Yeah, okay.
Run it in the cloud for me, I do not care how. And that was the contract. And then there's a few other things that you can also control, the services that you bind to the app and so on. And now enter Kubernetes, and there's this idea that the developers are going to interact with the Kubernetes, and actually in practice, they're interacting with the Kubernetes APIs. So they're generating these YAML files where they're creating their pods, and they're creating their policies, and they're creating their storage volume claims, all of these things. And what the industry hasn't really grappled with is this idea that Kubernetes is projects much more of an infrastructure dial tone.
Yeah, totally.
And that's probably not what application teams, app teams, DevOps teams really need, because that's actually going to slow them down.
Right.
And so
that was my meta point. You explained it. I love you're better, very more technical, but that's exactly my point.
And so now the question is, I'm 100% convinced that those low-level primitives in Kubernetes, while I adore them, I think they're fantastic, and all the engines underneath and the control loops that do great things with those abstractions are fantastic. What we need to do as an industry is start to figure out how do we up-level those things? How do we layer on top of those, take advantage of those low-level primitives, but present an API, present a contract to the app DevOps teams that allows them to stay efficient.
Do you think we're on the path, at least?
I think we're very, very early days. I think for the most part, we're just grappling with this idea at the moment.
To be fair to the Kubernetes lovers out there, and there are legions of them.
Me being one of them, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
What are we in, 1.0 or 1.1 of Kube at this
No,
point?
like 1.7, 1.8.
1.7.
I don't know.
It's still...
Yeah, but it's
I mean, I remember when it was the first 1.0 came out, right? It wasn't... So...
Yeah.
And when you're talking about something that so fundamentally changes the way we do things, is it realistic to expect that it would be mature while it was still immature? No, I think...
But I think
compare it to
point. Like again, I was just saying vaguely that the developers are now confused, but you're right. We had that Heroku-like contract. The purity of a pass was this Heroku-like contract where literally you put your code here, you hit a button, and like it happens. And if you wanted some type of service with Cloud Foundry, I mean, I was a big fan of Cloud Foundry early on. I do think it has to evolve in the Kubernetes world, and I know you agree. But you're right, like that we've lost all of that, of this idea that the developer really just wants to put this again. That's why I'll shut up in a second. Why they love Docker so much, because from the how do you scale, how do you orchestrate? It was I create an immutable object, I push it, and I'm
So I put it this way: like Kubernetes might be 1.7. Figuring out how to actually work with this stuff is like 0.1.
That's the point I was getting at.
That's the whole problem.
And let me throw another
We're
concept.
changing how you work, and that's totally different. And that's part's got to be figured out, because otherwise you can't escape this sort of infrastructure dial tone. I like that
I love that
word. You can't escape those primitives because and then anything you bake in is just going to be if everyone's doing 10 different things. You're going to satisfy one person and nine people that you're going to upset. So everything stays at that low level until people do the hard work and the fault starts to figure it out, and then you can kind of jump up a level and say, okay, now we've kind of got a common idea.
But nature abhors a vacuum, right? And so is that the vacuum that creates, let me bring it full circle first, is that the vacuum that creates this new ops or modern ops or whatever you want to call it? Is that ops' new mission? Is it just a maturation of Kubernetes? I mean,
I think that the modern ops in the context, at least we're kind of talking about at this conference, is we've got to figure that out. We have to figure out what to do so we can sort of start to build those primitives and standardize things. So this stuff that's now application, stuff that's now like sort of the things that we do individually in a company can kind of melt into the background. And you kind of saw that sort of at sort of the cloud primitives, like, with the rise of especially of AWS, like people just kind of, all right, this is sort of how things are supposed to work. This is how we work with it. We kind of have a sense for how that feels. Now it's no longer really contentious. And that's got to happen with the container, the kind of cloud native world.
You made a good point the other night. Like there's two sides to this, right? There's the kind of operations meta, and then the operations technology. Damon, hello.
Yeah, distracted by that.
Sorry, we had a distraction.
I mean, I think you described it really well. That we have to have two brains here. We have to have the operations meta of how we think about operationalization in the new world, not ITIL. But then there's the technology at the same time.
Yeah, it's both.
It's two pieces that have to be matured.
Yeah, it's like a complex or a complicated system. A complex system of technologies, and users and everything, and platforms interacting with a complex system called human beings. At the same time, but to solve both problems. I think people love to fall into one or the other and kind of forget that you've got to do both. Just giving everybody Kubernetes is not going to solve our problems because you're encasing it in this concrete of
from a
these
developer.
Old ways.
I love it.
But there's people out there think that.
No,
Give my hands on these new tools, all this stuff's going to go away, and then you see the chaos when in the blowback when people do that.
And that's the curse of being an evangelist, where you want, like for me being an evangelist, I want to push new edge technology, be very excited about it. And then you got to pull back a little to make sure people understand the complexities, and so it's a little push pull of like I'm very high on a lot of things going to Kubernetes, but then you're right, you have to kind of pull it back.
But that's classic crossing the chasm kind of stuff, right? You want to be a 15% early adopter. Well, that's the price you pay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
And that's the fun work, quite frankly.
Yeah. For some. For others, and in some organizations, depending how risk-averse they are.
No question.
Right? I was interviewing the folks from Capital One earlier, and the business person said, their job is measuring risk and risk management. And so when they look at new technologies, the risk is it mature enough? Is it going to create too much change or what have you, right? Now, some organizations like Cap One will go out there, right? They're way out there. Others are not as risk, right? They're more risk or less risk adverse.
Yep. And that kind of goes back to the Kubernetes has been out in open source for 3 years, quite frankly. It's been out there for a long time. But back to Damon's point, it's 0.01 in the enterprise.
Yeah.
And we do see some folks, we even saw Adidas this morning, who said, we're running Kubernetes clusters. But that is still pretty nascent in most organizations, and even within the organization, relatively small. And so, it's very early days still.
Yes, it is. But, I think back to VMware adoption, right? And how I thought that happened overnight. It was 5 years, maybe 6 years, right, till we saw really. I think Kubernetes, it might be half of that in terms of.
I'm not sure, because the thing about VMware and that adoption is that we weren't actually asking people to change things too radically. Mm-hmm. We weren't asking them to change their application structures. We were giving them the same exact primitives that they were using before in a hardware setting.
Just an hypervisor.
As virtualized. And now we're actually shifting the dial tone.
Change everything.
How many companies had they just had to hit their objective to move to to VMs.
Oh, it was
and they had
one
long, but a lot of them just had one long running VM on top of one physical
Exactly.
machine. Or okay, maybe we're gonna consolidate. So it means what, 5 long running VMs on one physical machine. So you're not really fundamentally changing how developers create,
changing the app layer.
and you're not really changing how you operate. You're just adding another kind of layer of complexity in there, or complication, I guess.
But this has been a long and winding road. I mean, cloud has, initial cloud was kind of lift and shift, and then we learned that was terrible, and so the whole cloud native, 12-factor. One of the greatest things I love about Pivotal, I had this kind of epiphany the other day, and it was at a customer, and we were debating whether Kubernetes and PaaS and where it should be, and one of the things they out and out said the greatest thing that that Cloud Foundry did for us is it forced us to do 12-factor act, because you couldn't. So I realized, I'm not paying as much tribute to a technology that has like you went to it, and to go to it you had to be 12-factor app, right? And that's kind of brilliant, right? Like you leave some people behind, but my longer point is this whole cloud native 12-factor, microservice, whatever you want to call it today. We've been winding down this path. When people started going to Amazon, they realized you really had to refactor stuff. You had to decouple. Went to containers. Of course, that was a beautiful collision of microservices and compute infrastructure. And what you guys have done with the 12-factor act and pushing that. So I mean, I think Kubernetes is going to move a little faster because a lot of the greenfield world in most enterprises is kind of hip to this this model, and so I think there's still going to be a lot of legacy stuff, but I do think it's still ugly, it's still the Wild West,
here's a thought. So think about that since we're here in jolly old England and talk a lot about history. That in every era of, or someone say the other day, every era of history thinks that they're the penultimate.
The serverless
history,
kids,
they've solved all the problems, right? So this is a question of we thought VMs were this is the future. It's gonna solve all the problems,
right? And
then it was this kind of cloud thing, and then it was remember OpenStack? Anybody? Right? That was gonna solve all of our problems, and then it's Docker is that's it. It's done. That's gonna solve our problems, right? And then it's no, we need Kubernetes, right? And now there's a serverless thing kind of lurking out there too. So we got to think about that. It might take 3 years for Kubernetes to to mature to more of a mainstream operation. But then, are we going to look back and go, "Oh, this was the OpenStack of the mid 2010s," and there's something 5 years from now, we're like, "Oh yeah, remember Kubernetes?" It's just one of those things where we foolishly thinking that this is it.
I'll hold
when there's a bunch of other things coming.
I think, and there's some people believe this, and I'm leaning in this camp, that Kubernetes could be the next Linux kernel. And I think Google has this idea that they could drive it down to be completely commodified and that it becomes the base way you run any application. I think it's naive to say that, giving what the world looked like 4 years ago.
Right.
But I do have this fundamental belief that's a possibility, that Kubernetes could be that layering, that it could be like a 10-year thing,
right? Or is there something else we need?
There certainly could be
something else. But think about how easy Linux was 20-25 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. We probably had similar conversations then.
But Linux is a 20-year run, right? There's a chance I think Kubernetes could be a 10 or 20-year run if it becomes fabric-based.
Yep.
Someone much smarter than me taught me that most of our changes are evolutionary, not revolutionary. And I think with Kubernetes, you're going to see a continued evolution. Don't look for the revolution.
I like that, yeah.
Unless it's the IT revolution. It's on the wall. The writing's on the wall.
That's a good place to end this one.
Yeah, I was wondering. That was a good...
All right. Hey, this was a fascinating conversation. I hope you folks enjoyed it. Again, Cornelia Davis, John Willis, Damon Edwards here at... where are we? We're at DevOps Enterprise Summit,
and Alan,
UK.
just point out, Cornelia's presentation, when is your presentation?
Tomorrow morning.
We have queued this up. The expectations are very high that this is going to be... And Damon's saying his presentation might be one of the best ones he's ever given. So
here's the good
by
news
the way,
at
folks,
home.
We'll see.
You can catch all of these presentations over on the IT Rev YouTube channel or through DevOps TV. And you can catch them there, and I'm sure they'll all be great. You guys, all three of you do great work.
Thank you.
All right. This is Alan Schimmel for DevOps.com, DevOps TV. Have a great day, everyone.